What might future cities look like, especially in the face of population growth, climate change, and constant economic winds? A team of builders, thinkers, planners have some truly fascinating thoughts. They are:
I'm Bill Baker.
Bill is a structural engineer, perhaps most famous for creating the Burj Khalifa, the tallest man-made structure in the world, in Dubai.
I'm Bill Retz.
Uyal is the Dean of the Illinois Institute of Technology College of Architecture.
Virginia Parks.
Virginia is an associate professor at the School of Social Services at the University of Chicago.
Saskia Sasson.
Saskia is a professor of sociology at Columbia University.
Antony Wood.
And Antony is the executive director of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. You will hear from them all in near chorus. Let's get started with cities and big data, or using large amounts of information to pull apart the mysteries of all the hustle and the bustle in the life of the city organism.
You can think of the city as an enormous set of big data. The challenge is, does that kind of transforming of all the data we have about cities into a big data set flatten the city to an extent that we don't recognize the city? So it becomes somewhat useless knowledge, useless data. And the challenge is, how do we create all the diversities, all the interruptions, if you want, that constitute the city into those big data sets? And then those big data sets could be extremely useful. But there is a possibility of making intersection of existing data sets. You know, when you put them online, when you digitize them, you can actually make them work together. And it might help address some of these more complex issues that we have, that when we intervene in one aspect of a city's problems, the other aspects become worse. You know, the one thing that one might say, when you bring all these different data sets together and you maintain a bit their specificity, that you can see how they interact with each other. And there is no simple solution in a complex space such as a city. So you might as well know what are the various things that are intersecting with each other.
Big data has been incredibly important for particularly planning transportation. Traffic engineers are gathering data from those systems. They use them then to predict all sorts of travel. The question then becomes, who owns the data, who controls the data, and if we can use that data to really respond to, I think, some fascinating patterns that big data can reveal for us. For instance, racial disparities or racial inequality or gender disparities in travel.
Actually, I think big data can be very unuseful, and I think that's partly what Saskia was saying. I think we've got to start to emphasize quality of data rather than quantity of data. And certainly in an urban setting, you know, dividing the total energy of a city by the number of inhabitants only gives you one level of sensitivity of the information that we need, and we need much more detailed studies into the whole gamut of people's lifestyles and the energy and sustainability implications of it. That's not happening at that detailed level as far as I'm concerned.
Our society and everything is changing so drastically. What we thought 5 years ago would happen in 50 years is maybe already happening in 5 years from now. Data predicts something, but the reality is maybe even quicker than what some data predict.
The big city wouldn't be big without a skyscraper. But what of its role in the future?
Well, certainly people are looking for more diversity. You know, one of the big things about sustainability is where it's not the business district's way over here and the living district's way over there and the shopping district somewhere else. Again, how do you get them all together so that you can minimize the transportation between them all? Almost every tall building we do in China is multiple use, usually a hotel, residential, and office in one tower with a little retail at the base. So there's the one single purpose tower is almost rare.
I think tall buildings kind of fall into two camps. They're either predominantly huge iconic buildings which are being used as much to brand cities as they are house corporations. That's the kind of 5% of the world's tallest buildings. The other 95% are the kind of average 40-story residential building that's being built, 5,000 of them a year in Asia. And there's a huge gap in between, because the second category, I believe, does not involve a lot of quality and a lot of things to progress the typology. And what I'm interested in is the gap in between those two, of how to improve that and actually de-emphasize the iconic nature of most of what the world's fascinated with in terms of the concept of skyscraper.
The question of the high-rise and tall buildings, of course, they are maybe a building with 20, 30, 50,000 people inhabiting that with different programs, as Bill said, but they are always in relationship to other high-rise buildings. And the question is how big a city can be is for me not the best question, because it depends on where and what condition that city is being built.
I think what Veal is talking about too is the flexibility of a city. And so that's really about movement and mobility. And so we need to think about movement within a big building, right? Commuting, we transportation planners think about the commute to work being also your elevator ride. So, but it's the flexibility, that ability to move within and between. It's being able to move within different nodes in a city, but also between cities.
What about things like population growth, climate change, or socioeconomic inequality? How are the cities handling them now, and how might they in the future?
It's actually a little miracle that our complex cities bring it all together. And I think it has maybe lasted for a good 100 years. And now it's spreading to more as we have more big cities in the world. My question is it breakable? And I think we're beginning to see breakdowns. And the breakdowns come in many different shapes. So for a while there, we had an assemblage of elements, of conditions, of capacities that worked together to make sure that we had fresh bread, fresh tomatoes, whatever it was, every day that we needed it. Will that last? I'm not sure.
Well, in New York City, there's a whole task force going on to the robustness of the infrastructure. After Sandy, a lot of buildings went down because their basements flooded. Okay, they lost all their mechanical systems, so it was only a limited part of the building, but it was the essential part of the building for the operations. So they went away. There's been a lot of power outages in New York that have happened. So there's this whole effort to see how can you make buildings and the city more robust and resilient. We've woken up that this is something that has to be done. In Boston, similar issues, particularly the coastal cities are very, very conscious about this, and many cities are actually starting to do something. The conclusions have not been reached. It's in progress.
I worry, and I wonder whether actually we're going to get to a point where humanity needs to be far more strategic with the siting of its cities. The most sustainable city is perhaps one where it doesn't take too much heat to warm it in winter, too much cool to cool it in summer, where there's a water resource, where it's not on a highly seismic fault. And I wonder, we're still in that period with sustainability where it's a matter of choice and not survival. It's still a matter of largely choice whether we turn down air conditioning and all the other things. But we are rapidly moving towards that point where it is going to be about survival. And I think we don't even realize the strategies we will have to put in place when it becomes survival. And one of those strategies is possibly packing up cities and moving into cities where it makes far more fundamental sense to base humanity there.
And finally, I asked my guests the same question. What is the best case future city that you can imagine? Here's what they said.
For me, it's the focus on transit-based development. Where people can get to the parts of the city and the other parts of the city without having to go to the automobile. And the transit could be mass transit, could be bicycles. It could be various modes, but the city is accessible and easily accessible. I think that'll make the cities much more livable and enable them to be much more dense, which I think in the end is a worthy goal because of the benefits both culturally as well as environmentally.
Cities will be much more dense, but cities will be hopefully also much more concerned about the neighborhood, about walking around, having your espresso, having your green area, and having transport is extremely important. So from this local momentum, I leave my home, whether I'm on the 162nd floor of a skyscraper or whether I'm living on one of the 0 levels, I am living in a neighborhood, and within a certain amount of time, I think within 7 minutes, I should be able to get all the things I need for my daily and weekly living. The way I see the city, I'm not seeing it in terms of shape, skyscraper or not, but densified areas with extremely livable neighborhood conditions.
So the city of the future is equitable and efficient. It's about building in that link between the built environment and social equity. Largely, that's going to be around fair housing, good jobs, and what really makes it work is an equitable and efficient transportation system that people can make real on these opportunities that exist in the city. It's interconnected. It also supports multi-modes of mobility. So it's about walking and bikes and buses and rail and connecting all of those pieces to make good on the good city.
What I see is some cities that will really have it all these ideal conditions that have been described now. And then there were other parts of the same city and other types of cities that will be more like shantytowns. Right now, none of our cities can handle all the people who at some point in that region, near or far, will need to access the city. Let's recall that in the last 5 years alone, 15 governments and 100 firms have bought almost 300 million hectares of land in Africa, in Latin America. They're now buying it up in Europe, preventing young farmers from buying land in France, etc. So the world that is emergent is a very disturbing place. The technologies, the possibilities, the resources on the one hand for great cities. But what about the rest?
So I think if you're looking for a vision of future cities, you only need to look at science fiction. I don't think there's been a science fiction city of the future that hasn't shown, a significant one that hasn't shown the multi-leveled city. I think it's quite frankly ridiculous that we are going ever more vertical in our cities without bringing in the horizontal, because the horizontal, the land, the ground plane, is the essential support mechanism for community, for circulation, for agriculture, for all those things. And yet we are going 10, 20, 30 times more vertical without bringing that in. So to the science fiction cinematographers that are creating these cities of future, albeit without the real world constraints that we're all working in, it is nonsensical to be coming down 250 stories for a cigarette break or a pizza. We need to start to connect and bring in a three-dimensional infrastructure. And the great thing is that it is happening. I can show you 50, 60 projects around the world with significant connections, and not only connection, but urban habitat in the sky. The key to it is to deliver that without the social stratification that we saw, that was the premise of Blade Runner and others, to deliver that vision of the city without the social and economic ramifications.